Alrighty, looks like we've gained a critical mass. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. This is our first Biotechnical Advocacy Lab of 2022. We are really excited to kick off the year, and we have a very special guest speaker today who's going to be chatting with us at the second half of the webinar. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to our colleagues at the Beekeeper Group to get us started. I'd like to introduce Mike Panetta. Mike is a founding partner of the Beekeeper Group, and he manages a number of the firm's nonprofit, trade association, and political clients. He's also an award-winning public affairs campaign strategist who specializes in using the internet and social media for creative issue advocacy and grassroots activism. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. Hopefully, everybody can see my screen. Just forwarded to the next slide. Great. Okay. Thanks for an introduction. I'm Mike Panetta. Like previously said, I'm a partner here at Beekeeper Group. We've been partnering with Bio on the Advocacy Lab for about a year now, and excited to talk to you today about activating your network at a state level. We're going to keep our remarks on our end on the brief side today because we want to make sure there's enough. We give plenty of time for our guest speaker, who I'll introduce when we get to that level, so to get to that section. So today I'm going to be talking about state level advocacy. There's a lot of overlap with congressional, but I'm going to focus on the nuances at the state level. We're going to talk about setting yourself up for the new year for 2022 and the legislative sessions, creating some materials for success, and then we're going to hear from Oliver Rocroi from the California Life Sciences Association as the guest speaker today. So to jump right into it, let's talk about some of the state level advocacy nuances. Back a slide. So when we're going to talk about what's different at the state level and how that will affect your communication strategies, your grassroots programs, and your interaction with decision makers, and obviously these nuances are going to vary from state to state, but overall, what we're going to talk about today is true across all the states, especially when it compares to Congress. So a few points to keep in mind here. Now, many of us are based in DC or we work with Congress at some level. So our advocacy focus is primarily focused around the national legislature and the various personalities, committees, partisanship battles, and leadership or lack thereof in that body. But things are very different when you zoom into the state level. First of all, it shocks people to find out that there are so many more people in the United States that have the title of a member of a state legislature. There's over 7,300 people who are state legislators in the United States, compared to only 535 members of Congress. So that means there's just more of them, and it's just more. They're more accessible. They're more ingrained in the community than a member of Congress or a U.S. senator as it comes to numbers of people. And on average, the representatives represent about a tenth of the number of people that a average U.S. House member represents. About 61,000 people on average for a state representative, compared to 700,000 for average U.S. House members. Obviously, the Senate, U.S. Senate members are different based on state, but on the population percentage, House members about 700,000. So they represent. There's so many more of them, and they represent so much fewer people. And they're also most of them are not professional legislators. Obviously, there's some bodies that are full time. And that is their full-time occupation, but in many states they have other jobs or occupations. They're not full-time. They're also, these are the things that make them more accessible as they operate in smaller circles. They're more part of the everyday life than congressional representation. However, it's still like Congress. There's still a need to figure out for your advocates to understand the process, know how things work, and for groups like you to have champions for your issues, because the state chambers obviously still have plenty of politics, and finding the right allies is key. When we talk about advocating at the state level, in a congressional office, a number of communications that come in to break through the clutter is at a much greater scale than in a state legislator's office. they, because going back to how many people they represent so many fewer people. So take 100 letters or phone calls coming into a state office, that's on the radar immediately for that representative. Where in a congressional office, that has to filter through a lot of staff, and that's really only going to get the ball rolling in most cases. So because of this scale, the quality going into state offices, we think needs to be much higher. It's a tighter audience. It's much more local. So the constituency is more that of neighbors than they are at a congressional level. So the message or the shared story it will resonate so much more within that office than it will be from a DC office. So when we're talking, it's a smaller pool. It's a smaller pool of constituencies of constituents. So getting those messages in, they need to be a higher quality than just the form letters than you bombard congressional offices with, because it goes both ways. The state representative is probably going to know more people in the district on a personal basis than a member of Congress will. So having that higher quality touch point is much more key in when working with state offices. This also goes to the media markets as well. So it's a smaller media market that the state representative, the state senator is concerned with. So it's easier to break through with something like a letter to the editor, or other outreach efforts are easier to do at the state level. So, the title of this slide is quality versus quantity. At the state level, I think the focus should be more on quality, because you have those, it's much easier to get those high quality touch points than it is at a congressional level, where quality is obviously important there, but quantity is what you need to break through. You don't need that as much at the state level. So also at the state level, issues are more tangible. So, Congress is the national news. They deal with the big issues. And it takes up there's a lot of time and attention and national attention focused on them. But obviously, there's a lot of activity that happens at the state level, and it has a much more direct impact on the everyday life of the advocates that you're working with. So the results of these decisions are made at this level are much likely to be felt and seen by the decision makers. And for the nuance here for advocacy professionals and for the advocates that you work with is to make these effects clear for the legislator, as they're voting on policies and laws that directly affect their neighbors. This is where localization comes in. This is much like what we do for Congress. When we advocate at the congressional level, we try to break down issues by the state or by the district and how they're going to have the impact on the constituency. That's still an important tactic. And here it's much more tangible because it's not breaking it down by a large congressional district that has many towns. The state representatives usually represent the one town or maybe parts of a town. So if you're able to make that issue even more tangible and more localized, you're going to have a greater impact on changing the opinion or shaping the opinion and eventually the vote of that state legislator. So if it's possible to find facts and stats that break down the issue for that legislator's district, and that can be tough for some issues, I know, but it makes it very real. As going back again, the legislator will really know many of the people in this district, and there's not a professional staff that's going to filter that for them. So the more you can have your advocates tell their story about how it affects them and how it affects their community, I mean, that's advocacy 101, but at the state level, that's even more important because it's so much more granular for those legislators. A lot of what we try to do for advocacy is we try to get our advocates to tell their story, and when you do that at congressional level, it's super important. But at a state level, remember that there's so many fewer people that each story that comes in is going to represent a greater percentage of the thoughts and the feelings of the smaller state level districts. So getting each story will have that much greater of impact. Each patient advocacy story, each story of how this issue affects me and my family, it's going to have a much greater impact because it's a it's a smaller audience. You'll have a much greater return on investment in getting those stories in at the state level. So those are a couple, top level reasons why state level advocacy is different than Congress, because it's much more local, it's much more neighbors. You're much more likely to actually know your state representative or have people in your network who know the state representative than you are the U.S. Senator or a U.S. representative. So taking advantage of that with higher level contacts, higher quality contacts, and better and more localized information to make your case is critical. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about heading into 2022 and setting up for the new year. Again, this is sound advice for any advocacy project. So I'm going to focus a little bit here on the state nuances here, but like any advocacy campaign, it's important to define your goals heading into the legislative session if you haven't already. Are you trying to pass a bill, stop the erosion of an existing policy? And be sure to share your goals with your advocates so everybody knows what the goals are for the year, and provide some sort of initial action that they can take so they're invested right away in the goals of what you're trying to do in this legislative session, whether it's just sending a note to their a message to their state representative that I'm here and the new session's kicking off and I hope you prioritize A, B, and C. Just something that you can, and then you can get into the details later and more specific actions as the bills work their way through the session. But just kicking it off the bat, letting your advocates know it's a new year, it's a new legislative session. Here are our goals. We need you to jump in right now. Will help kickstart it. And also with the state legislative sessions, they're usually across the country. They're busy in the first half of the year, sometimes even shorter. So make sure that you know the key dates. It's not like Congress where they're just in session for 2 years until the next election. Like, for example, in Maryland, they meet for 90 days, and then sometimes they can extend that with a 3/5 vote of both houses. And there are special sessions as well. It varies from state to state, but making sure you know that and planning ahead and making sure that your whatever your advocacy goals are for that session align to the calendar of the legislative session, because making sure you have that timeline and working backwards from it is key. And it usually makes sense to have, I'm sure, I'm preaching to the choir here, but having somebody on the ground in each state who knows this, who can report this, who's embedded, who knows the ins and out of the state capital and the timing is critical, because they can feed that intelligence back to you and make your advocacy that much stronger. Moving on, we'll talk about preparing your allies for the upcoming session. So obviously you have legislative champions. You need someone to carry your water in the state capitol, to use a metaphor. Who's going to introduce the legislation, who's going to help line up co-sponsors, shepherd it through committees of jurisdiction, handle amendments. I mean, hopefully these people have already been identified and you've been working with them for several sessions in the past. But make sure make sure at the beginning of the session you're meeting with them. Again, you're sharing your goals with them. This could be virtually or in person, depending on the situation. And again, the access to these state legislators is a lot easier than in Congress. So take the time to develop those and strengthen those individual relationships with the people that you need to move this forward, move your goals forward. Make sure your advocates, like I said before, educate them on their goals and let them know that's a new session. Make sure they have the policies that they need to advocate. These are the people who are going to be making the calls, writing the letters, attending virtual or in-person events. The basics of issue advocacy are still the same at the state level. You want to educate, you want to mobilize them around key issues, but the nuance here at the state level when you're communicating is that everybody is in the same state. So you have much more in common with your list of advocates right off the bat than you would with, say, a large national list that you'd be advocating on issues. So instead of getting emails about saying it's Congress and it's Washington, it's more about it's legislators. It's not Congress in Washington, it's state legislators in Hartford, Annapolis, Topeka. So you're able to be much more, drill down much I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. So just you're able to, the message that you sent to your advocates, you're able to be much more specific right off the bat because everybody's in the same state. But from there, that's where the power of segmentation can make it really personal. If you're able to segment your messages to only a specific town or a specific set of districts, you can go much more nuance with your message to those advocates and make sure they have the materials to advocate and drive home why it's important to advocate. And then the last bullet here is the potential advocates. You have a recruitment goal this year. We always talk about with advocacy campaigns is recruit, educate, and mobilize. If you already have a list of advocates, you already have the educate and mobilize part down. But what about the new blood that's needed? It's a basic, it's a basic rule that the more relevant an issue is to an individual, the more likely they are to take action. So think of a plan to bring in new people who should care about this issue and have them take some sort of action. And ideally, you're shoring up districts where you might be a little weak, maybe committees of jurisdiction, making sure you have enough advocates in those districts. There's things you could do to bring them in. There's online advertising. There's issue petitions. There's things you can do to bring in new voices and people who aren't engaging yet into the fold. We also are big fans in setting up materials for success. So we've talked about educating and mobilizing and recruiting, educating and mobilizing. This is where it's really the education part of it. So we're big fans of making online toolkits that have a variety of materials that can be used by advocates. And the main goal, and this isn't, this is something that's done at all levels of advocacy, is having these materials, having the infographics, the frequently asked questions, social media copy, graphics. You don't need to recreate the wheel with this. There's a lot of examples out there on how to tell a story and how to create these creative pieces. But the key here is, again, to make that localized connection, make it as specific to the state as possible. Because again, the more specific it is to an individual, the more it affects their daily life, the more it resonates with them, their pocketbook, and their community, the more likely they are to take action. So you can see some of the things that we've created here. I'm going to show you a couple quick examples of things that we've done as toolkits. On the left here, we've created a toolkit for, we work with the International Franchise Association, and this is the table of contents for an online toolkit we created for them that has issue briefs on liquidity, liability. There's things they can download for email campaigns, for social media content. And the other example here is a piece of a social media toolkit for acting on social media for a group called Oregonians for medication access. That was something we did for the Consumer Healthcare Products Association as a campaign to preserve over-the-counter purchases of cold and allergy medicine. But this was part of a larger toolkit. For this, you can see we had state-specific social media messages that activists could download or not download, but share right from the website that drove people to an action center that was, again, very Oregon specific, and it was Oregon branded. So it made it more relevant to the target audience for these because it was focused on the state itself. The last thing I'm going to leave you with before I pass it off to our guest speaker is training your advocates at the state level. One of the things that's come out of the pandemic and being remote and working from home or working remote is people are obviously much more used to being in front of their screens in situations like this where they're getting content in a webinar or a video conference format. And that's great for training. Training your advocates on the nuances of how a state legislator works, who their representatives are, how to contact them, how to talk to them, sort of the basic 101 stuff for your newer advocates, and then advance to more 201 level advanced advocacy topics for more of your seasoned advocates. Never assume people understand how everything works. We as advocacy professionals work in this day in, day out. Your advocates don't. And sometimes we assume they know a lot more than they do. So having this touch point and having this training opportunities are, I think, something that a lot of groups are starting to explore more. And one of the things we've been doing a lot is putting together what we call online learning modules. So they're basically courses small courses that you can put together, and they're pretty easy to set up, and we can talk to anybody who's interested in doing that. Is setting up sort of a course, like how to talk to your legislator, how to advocate on a bill, and they're online, but they're not live. They can be done at the advocates at their own time, but there's quizzes at the end, and we usually set it up in such a way that the people take the course, they learn, and then they take a quiz at the end and they get certified, and it's a badge they can wear, or a recognition in the organization. And we find that goes a long way to help to educating your advocate base, getting them trained and getting them knowing the nuances of the issue, being able to talk about it with their legislator. Again, the key here, the thing I'll leave you with before I pass it off to the guest speaker, is that at the state level, everything you try to do needs to be as localized as possible, because the state legislators are more of the neighbors. They're more ingrained in the local community than the members of Congress, the senators. So there's more of a chance that your advocates are going to personally know the state legislator or see them at an event, and you want to be able to have them trained up and be able to talk intelligently about your issues and make the ask of what your advocacy goals are for the session. At the state level, you're much more likely to have those interactions than you will at the congressional level. So it's really on you to make sure that you take the time to educate your people and get them trained up to be able to make those asks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker today.
Yeah, and before we do that, Mike, I just wanted to thank you again for your great presentation. I learned so much. Before I pass it over to Ali, I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions for Mike. If you want to put your hand up or pop it in the chat, either one. Mike, I actually had a few questions. I apologize, my dog is barking in the background. You had mentioned the importance of quality over quantity. I was wondering if you had any insight on whether you think these state legislators prefer one sign-on letter with multiple groups signed on, or if you think individualized letters from multiple groups would be more helpful.
That's a good question. When it comes to the groups, I really, honestly, I don't know. I think either one is powerful. I do think that if you had one letter signed on by everybody, it shows sort of that unity and that strength of a group, that all these groups have agreed to one letter, and they've taken the time to organize themselves and deliver it as a package. But on the flip side of that, getting multiple letters from different organizations just shows that sort of steady drumbeat coming in as well. So, I hate to answer it depends, but they both have their strength. The quality of the message, thinking about that a little more, the quality of individual letters, each organization could customize their letter in a way that speaks to the constituency they serve. But I think they all need to, if you're working as a coalition, for example, and you do that and you take that tactic, they all have to have the same ask. So they're all coming at it with different different nuances, different angles, but they have to have that same ask at the end. So there's sort of a unified, this is what we want as a community, as a coalition.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then just kind of following up on that, you had mentioned the importance of, we're all in this virtual atmosphere right now, and it's the start of these legislative sessions. So really trying to get yourself out there and prioritize all of your goals for the year is really important as we're starting out. How do you really make yourself stand out? Because I'm assuming all of these legislators are being inundated with a lot of letters and emails and requests for meetings. So how do you make your group in particular, or your letter in particular, stand out?
Yeah, I think that's where it goes back to that high quality touch and making sure that you're not just a form letter coming into the office, which is the easy thing to do, is have your people, send them to a website where they're all sending the same letter. The more you can have, it's sort of a two-pronged approach. You're as the organization, you're going to have your official message going in, but you're also going to, part of what we're talking about today was getting your advocates, sort of the grassroots, also weighing in on that. And the more that you can have your grassroots weighing in with customized, personalized messages that talk about the issue and how it relates to them and why it's important for the legislator to support this bill or this policy, whatever the advocacy ask is. The more that you can back up your official ask as the organization with sort of that public echo of your constituents weighing in, of the constituents of that legislator weighing in with personalized messages, I think that is what makes you stand out. And then being able to not just do that in a virtual environment or an email or message into the legislator's office, but being able to support that in the community by having real people reach out to the legislator who know that person and can see them in the community and talk to them in the community. I think those are the things that will really make you stand out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Touching on the community voice, we always speak to the importance of the patient voice and how important it is to leverage the patient voice. So I think if you can really get out there and get those local members of your community to speak up on these issues, that would make a huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just going to add, does anybody have any questions while we have Mike on the line? All righty. Well, thank you again, Mike. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Barrett Stratford. She's the Director of External Relations here at Bio, and she's going to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Megan. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. I'd like to welcome our friend Oliver, who serves as the Vice President of Federal Government Relations and External Affairs at California Life Sciences. At CLS, Oliver is responsible for the development and implementation of external communication strategies, directing their advocacy activities, and incorporating strategic communications and alliance development objectives into CLS's work. At Bio, we are very fortunate to collaborate with Oliver and CLS on a variety of policy issues at the state and federal levels through our Council of State Bioscience Associations. So he's going to be touching on CLS's grassroots work and some of their best practices in this space. So with that, thank you, Oliver, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Barrett. Thank you, Megan. Mike, pleasure. That was a great presentation. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thanks for having me. Barrett, thank you for that introduction. I will add only one thing. I currently work on federal stuff. I used to do state work. I've been a district director for a member of the legislature, a chief of staff. I've done comms. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is really the perspective that Mike touched on, which is how do you match your message with your messenger in a way that resonates to the people you're trying to influence. And then just one little point of housekeeping. I'm going to use some slides today. They're available for anybody that wants them. I'm not going to go through each slide individually. It's got our old logo on it, which is fine. We dropped the A and we got a new logo, so disregard the logo, but all this stuff is available for anybody that wants it. Mike touched on it, and I will repeat it. I think it's a phrase that all of you are probably very familiar with, and that is all politics is local. It is never truer than in the case of grassroots advocacy. And the slide on the page right here is really the fact that advocacy is a campaign, right? It's a combination of things that help you drive influence. In our particular case, most of the time it's trying to get someone to vote a particular way, or not vote, or introduce a bill, or take some action. And that action is always influenced, like every human being on the planet, by the feedback they receive, urging them to do things. So legislative advocacy, the communications piece, the grassroots piece, the political piece, if there is one, all boils down to pulling the right levers at the right time to get to your objective. Next slide, please. I'm going to use a couple examples that I'm going to walk through very quickly just to illustrate the point. Mike touched on it. For those of you that live in DC, I've never seen more political ads than in DC, and all of those ads are targeted at members of Congress, but they target them in a way that is so specific that it always makes me laugh. In particular, our friends in the tech community are running ads in DC that very specifically reference Section 230, which is inside baseball, right? And so dumbing it down, if you will, at the state level and finding the message that resonates for folks on the ground is really an ability to distill, one, your objective, two, your target, and then three, the tools at your disposal. And the tools can be your advocates, but it's also your message. In this particular case, you can go to the next slide. There was a bill that was introduced in California that dealt with animal research, and it would have banned animal research, which, as we know, our member companies use. It's required by the FDA, but it's also a very sensitive and emotional issue. And it was a tough one. The bill was introduced. Industry was a little isolated, so we had to think outside the box because we couldn't just say, no, you're wrong. Animal testing is a great thing and we need to do it. Right? That wasn't a winning message. So in partnership, and you can go to the next slide, please. In partnership with some of our partners that we work with, Bio, of course, but also some of the research folks, we built a coalition. And next slide. We started off with, a mountain to climb. This was animal research. Everybody who owns a pet was, very emotional about the thing. And the folks on the other side made a very compelling case. Y'all can think about it, the animal cruelty, yada, 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 yada. We had a very tough hill to climb. So in thinking about how we were going to drive change and influence, next slide, please. We did a lot of research. And fortunately, we came across the fact that there had been an incident, unfortunately, where some members of an animal rights group had firebombed the house of a researcher at the UC system, the University of California system, doing research in this space. And so we were able to shift the narrative, and it went from banning animal research, next slide, please, to all of a sudden being about personal safety of the folks that were doing the research. And the research moved away from either the specific type of research they were doing on animals or not on animals, and it just became about protecting innovation and the folks that are really driving innovation. So clear messaging, right? Our ability to remove red tape, our ability to tug at the heartstrings a little bit to counter the heartstrings that were being pulled on the other side. Not that we were equating the two, but some folks viewed it as, okay, do I protect the animal or do I protect the researcher? That tipped the scale, right? Because all of a sudden it became a human element. Next slide, please. Third-party validation. If you can get, Mike touched on it, letters to the editors, op-eds from the people that your targets listen to. There was a great story in Politico last year. As we all know, a lot of moving pieces in DC, and there was a story about a little newspaper in Delaware all of a sudden being flooded with ads for the very simple reason that the president of the United States likes to read his hometown newspaper. So all of a sudden, everybody was doing ads in that newspaper because they knew the president would see it. Same thing for us, right? We had to find local outlets that could repeat our message in a way that made it relevant to the folks that we were targeting. Next slide, please. Activating our membership, and I'll touch on this a little bit. I think a lot of the other slides are more tactical in terms of how we do it, but activating your stakeholders, one, identifying who they are, two, being creative. And what I mean by that, in the state of California, there are 53 members of Congress. There are 120 legislators. There are 40 in the state Senate and 80 in the state legislature, in the state assembly. Each member of the California Senate represents about 1 million people, so large constituencies. There are also 58 counties in the state of California, each of which has a county board of supervisors, and then there's 243 or so cities, each of whom has a city council, a mayor, right? Lots of folks to target. So sometimes when you're going after a member of the state legislature, you have constituent groups, voters in this case, could be their neighbor, could be somebody with whom they have a pre-existing relationship. If they're, for example, a Rotarian, targeting other Rotarians so that the Rotarians are helping to influence a fellow Rotarian is an effective strategy. If they're a veteran, obviously activating veteran groups. if they work out, if they go to a particular gym, if you know that they're active in the Boy Scouts or AYSO or something, finding folks that are going to help you tell your message that have a link back to that person. Mike touched on, most people know their state legislator or their mayor or their city council members. You see them at the grocery store, you know where they live. There's no better advocate than somebody they know and trust already. So how you build that database is also, it takes a little bit of creative thought. It's finding a group of people that are going to engage on issues. Best advice I ever got when I was a lot younger is that what we do is not normal for most people, right? Most people don't read the paper every day and think about how they're going to influence policy. And most people wake up in the morning and they're worried about getting to work or school on time, raising their kids, like making enough money to retire, like simple things. So when we recruit advocates to help, thanking them, recognizing their value, and then also having them diversify their message. Unfortunately, sometimes in our world, in the biotech world, particularly on the healthcare side, we have to oppose legislation that gets introduced that would negatively impact our industry. So a lot of times we're asking our grassroots folks to say, no, I don't like this, vote no, vote no, vote no. Every once in a while, and as often as you could actually, get your advocates to say thank you, or we like this, or come at it from a different angle. Example I'll use, state of California is a pretty diverse place, large metropolitan areas, some agricultural areas, some rural areas. There are members of the legislature that we know do not have a particular affinity for the life sciences because of the healthcare debates around pricing and all that stuff. But some of them have agricultural backgrounds or industrial backgrounds. So if we can approach them and talk to them about the life sciences and the impact of the life sciences on food and ag, or on synthetic and renewable materials, or even climate change. California is a very progressive place. There are many members of the legislature where we start the conversation talking about the things that we know they're interested in, and then we pivot back to, if you care about this type of research, you've got to protect the innovation that is really part of that whole ecosystem. So again, matching messenger and message. Next slide, please. Some of this stuff is just tactical. You can keep going, Megan. So just to recap a little bit, and these are all tactics that we have used. It takes a little bit of money, but the investment is worth it. If you've got a website, you can leverage that. If you have, your database doesn't need to be fancy. It can be an Excel spreadsheet. We have a database of folks. It's a couple thousand strong. But in most cases, for most campaigns, you're really only activating a couple hundred people. And if you can get them to engage often, you don't need a real big group. Next slide, please. One of the ways that we started building our database is we started to tell positive stories about the life sciences ecosystem and its impact on the general population. The value of innovation, obviously the pandemic has helped, but even prior to that, patient stories, success stories, feel-good stories that really allowed us to say, do you support the life sciences and are you willing to be a champion for the industry? Next slide, please. Thank you ads, I referenced these. These are all PowerPoints that we did in-house. You don't necessarily need fancy graphics. We put them up on our social media. Legislators are people too. So a lot of times just thanking them for their support or thanking them for an action they took is as good, if not better, at building your credibility for the next time you have to ask them for a more difficult vote. So just reminder to thank people when you can, your advocates, your targets, right? It's all part and parcel of that campaign. Next slide, please. Patient-centric videos, we had a little bit of budget 3-4 years ago. So with the help of our member companies, we put some real short 30-second soundbite, almost living room interview videos of some patients talking about what the life sciences ecosystem and the innovation in California meant to them. And then we use that to help recruit advocates, but also help influence legislators. Next slide, please. Our digital action, Mike touched on it. It's easier and easier these days to do stuff digitally. Used to be you had to print a letter, put a stamp on it, ask somebody to sign it, like take it to the mail. Now you can email folks, you can use Twitter. It's a lot easier to get people activated. Now, the flip side of that is you don't want to just flood somebody's inbox with a bunch of generic letters that don't mean anything. The question was asked earlier. In my experience, if you can get 5 different letters from 5 different people that have a pre-existing relationship with that legislator, they're all saying globally the same thing, but the words are a little bit different. It's more effective than 100 letters that say the same thing with a digital signature at the bottom that don't have that same personal touch. Next slide, please. We've got some examples of ads. Next one. Next slide, please. Yeah, all these are examples of activation campaigns. You can keep going. We can, yeah. So this is all stuff on our website. We're happy to share it. We're a resource for any CSBA member. Obviously any of you that are bio members, they've got a phenomenal toolkit on their website. Bio is a resource, but some of the other associations, us, Biocom, Mass Bio, New Jersey, there's plenty of us that do this stuff, that have tools that we're always willing to share. So rather than recreate the wheel, look to your fellow associations for help. So I'm trying to see if I covered everything, and then we can open it up for questions. Yeah, I think, general summary for me. I think weird, and my wife hates it when I say this because I use her as the example, but everything in life is a campaign. And when I started courting my wife, planning out where I was going to take her, which of her friends I needed to work on, that's all part of this whole campaign thing, right? So as you approach and as you build out your grassroots advocacy, think about your ultimate purpose. You don't want to just create a database of people to say, yeah, we got a database of people that we use once a year when there's a big issue to send out a form letter. What objective are you driving to? How can you better refine your message to make it worthwhile for them, keep them engaged, keep them as active participants rather than, feeling like they're just occasional tool, and then be very deliberate in the way that you approach it. The worst thing you can ever do, particularly at the state level, is activate without respecting the timeline. If the vote is today, a bunch of letters this morning aren't going to help me. If the vote is yesterday, a bunch of letters tomorrow is going to feel like, well, these guys don't know what they're doing. So planning, preparation, and then just thinking through as a human, what would move and motivate you, and then applying that same kind of logic to any activation campaign at the grassroots level is really kind of the key takeaway. But with that, Megan, Barrett, happy to open it up for questions if there are any.
Yeah, Ollie, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I will say, as a graduate of the University of Delaware, I very much appreciate the Delaware shout out. But does anybody have any questions for Ollie?
I have a quick question for Oliver. Can you share more about some of the multi-state collaborations that you lead and how those have been helpful with your overall advocacy strategy?
So we often are asked to partner with some of the other associations, some of whom I mentioned, mostly on federal advocacy. Congress, and in particular the committees of jurisdiction, are never single state. California skews a little heavy just because we've got 53 members of Congress and the math works that way. But Cures 2.0, for example, Fred Upton is from Michigan. You got Diana DeGette. You got folks that are not California natives. So getting a letter that only has CLSA and Biocom on it doesn't mean much. But if we get Michigan Bio engaged, that helps. So on a multi-state level, at least federally, and from a regulatory standpoint too, because we can't forget CMS and FDA, it just shows the diversity of our industry across the entire country. We are spoiled in California, and I say that we're spoiled in that we've got such a vibrant ecosystem that we tell this California story, but our story as an industry is really a national story. And in the same way that I try to remind our teams that when we talk about the life sciences, human healthcare is important, but we have member companies, synthetic biology, renewable, climate change, all that stuff. That's part of that whole story. So when we're advocating and we're talking about any impacts to the life sciences ecosystem, that is a multi-state, in some cases, international effort. And so partnering with those other associations just gives us more credibility when we're engaging at that level. In the same way, by the way, that if you take that and you apply it to state and local, a letter from an organization that is statewide, that is co-signed by the local chamber of commerce, maybe a local economic development group, maybe a handful of individuals that are prominent either in business or otherwise. I used the Rotary as an example earlier. If there are opportunities to engage other groups and add them to your advocacy efforts, strength in numbers is always a better approach.
Thanks. I just had a quick question, Ollie. So you mentioned the importance of saying thank you, and I think that's a really important point just because we are asking a lot of our legislators. So it's important to remember that they are in fact people. I was curious if you had any opinions on the use of social media, if you think that's preferred, that kind of public touch, you're publicly acknowledging that you're thanking them, or if you think a personal phone call or personal email would mean a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to say this delicately. Nationally, the average age of most elected officials is dropping, which then means you have more and more elected officials that are more connected to every tool at their disposal, including social media. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, not just Twitter, right? I'm old enough that I can say this, I hope, but there are legislators that are, almost half my age that are on TikTok and Instagram and not on Twitter. So if you're just trying to talk to them on Twitter, you've missed that demographic. And so I think social media is an engaging tool, particularly for folks that in most cases have to run for re-election every 2 years, right? I mean, running for office is essentially a popularity contest, and it's for them enriching to be able to see that they have friends, because most elected officials always generally hear from people that are complaining, right? I mean, it's that same adage of most people don't write positive reviews on websites or otherwise. So thanking them on social media, personal phone call, showing up to their office, helping causes that they care about. We've had member companies that are willing, and it's a privilege, to maybe cut some checks to local foundations that matter to local legislators. Could be AYSO, could be other things. That's also a gesture of saying thank you in a way that is a little different. And so, like all of us, they're humans, and I think they appreciate that little extra touch. And anytime you can make that extra touch, I would certainly encourage it.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think it goes back to Mike's point as well, just to make yourself stand out and to make your group stand out. It really helps to make those personal touch points and those personal connections to show that this is what you're truly passionate about and that, you know, you're going to keep fighting for your cause. So thank you. Does anybody have any other questions for either Mike or Ollie before we wrap up here today? All righty. Well, thank you again. I personally learned so much. I always do on these calls. So I really appreciate you joining us. I know you're calling in from the West Coast, so it's a little bit earlier for you over there, but we really appreciate you being here with us today, Ollie. So thank you again. And thank you to Mike and our friends at the Beekeeper Group. And I will see all of you for our next webinar in February. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Team Bio. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks,
Everybody.
everyone.